Hi, welcome to Cubs and Culture for, it's still the 11th. I'm going to try to get this up by midnight. Hopefully I do. Anyway, before we move on to Gentleman's Agreement, which is his next film, I want to do a little bit of a retrospective because we're at our 10-year mark. So from 1938 to 1947, I would say, 1, 2, 3, 4... 5 of the films are directly connected to social issues, and really the last 3, The Lost Weekend, The Best Years of Our Lives, and Gentleman's Agreement, are all very much about societal problems. And so for this like group of this 10%, a little bit more than 10% of the Best Picture winners, they're really narrowly focused, and they're the most if I remember correctly, this group is the most narrow in terms of the type of film they award, because it's basically a whole bunch of important subject movies. And even though I like most of them a lot, it still feels very, very limited in that way. And really outside of the possibilities of Rebecca, there's really not really a genre piece, and even in ones which I don't really think are about society per se or social issues, like Going My Way, there's still a societal aspects to that film. So like in Going My Way, there's a character that goes off to fight in World War II, for example, or in Al Green Was My Valley, there's still the union stuff, even though it's not really focused on. Anyway, so let me bring up the Gentleman's Agreement. See you in a sec. Okay, turning to Gentleman's Agreement directly, this is sort of the quintessential important subject movie because it's about a Gentile reporter who's writing a series on anti-Semitism who pretends to be Jewish for the piece to get into the skin of the Jewish American experience. Which is fine, and I think the movie does a relatively good job of handling the various sociological issues. It does a remarkable job of working with what we would call microaggressions today and covert versus subvert bigotry, etc. And that's one of the clips I'm mostly going to show. Kazan, who's the director, does a really good job of keeping the cinematic techniques minimum and letting the screenplay and the actors fend for themselves. Now, and the acting is very, very good. Now, I have a sort of a huge conceptual problem with this movie, in that the Phil Green, who is the Gregory Peck, the main character, who's a Christian credentile, he reaches the conclusion because he's just handed the assignment and he's trying to do it from a factual perspective, what we would say, 100 Jews were killed, were Jew bashed in New York City last year, and the newspaper says that they don't want fact and figures, they want something different, and so he kind of beats his head against the wall. And so the first act climax is him having this epiphany that when he wanted to write about coal mining, he went and mined coal, or if he wanted to write about unions, he went and joined a union, etc. So for him to write about anti-Semitism, he needs to experience anti-Semitism, blah, blah, blah. And that's where the bet comes from. Now, the thing is, that's fine, and I swear to God, this is where that experiment comes from, with Minority Says, imagine if you were a white guy was a black guy, or imagine you were gay, etc., which is a premise from a whole bunch of different films, and it's a trope and everything. Now, here's my problem with this. The movie is claiming correctly that to really understand bigotry or anti-Semitism, more specifically, you have to have the lived experience of it. That's why he pretends to be Jewish. My problem with that is, why didn't the filmmakers then just go all the way and make the movie about a Jewish reporter? Okay? It seems like it feels like they should have, by their own sort of argument within the film, that you have to experience it directly. And I presume they didn't do it that way because of funding and because of the Gentile audience not being able to relate to a Jewish character, etc. So there's but it feels like they should have done that, or there's different ways of structuring this where you maybe have him experience one thing you could have him do is sort of like a metaphor and have him experience and have everyone else around him. I mean that's also problematic. I don't know. It just feels weird to me that the movie reaches this conclusion. Hey, you can't actually understand the Jewish American experience without being Jewish. So let's have a guy pretend to be Jewish as opposed to centering the story on a guy who's actually Jewish. And it just seems weird and wrong and sort of anti-Semitic itself. Anyway, so let me bring up the trailer and some clips. It's a very handsome film, very tastefully staged, and lighting Kazan does stages stuff well. Anyway, give me a moment. Okay, other than that problem with why didn't they just make the main character Jewish, they tried to justify it by having a character, Kathy, who is liberal and not anti-Semitic but passive, goes along to get along with it, sort of covertly anti-Semitic as a way of dramatizing that it's not really a little bit actually like Get Out, that the main problem really isn't the overt, at this time it would be Nazis, but neo-Nazis today, who are overtly, very obviously anti-Semitic. It's more the people who feel awful about it but just don't say anything. And so Kathy is a love interest for Phil Green, who's the main character. He's the journalist who pretends to be Jewish. And their relationship gets strained because of her implicit bias. And I really like... So on the one hand, I really like... So that's the only thing that could possibly justify it, because of... There's other ways of doing that sort of relationship. About to pretend to be Jewish, to get at the sort of the same point about the great mass of people who just go along to get along, really being the issue, not so much the overt anti-Semites. In any case, there's that. Ultimately, I think that the film mostly works, despite all the sort of moral objections. The one thing I don't really like about this film in terms of cinematic quality, is that love story is very, very forced, and very, very unrealistic, because they get engaged. They get engaged 3 weeks into the not 3 weeks, 3 days into the relationship, and they're both. In his case, Phil's wife died, but in her case, she was already been divorced. So everything like that just feels very too plotty, and so that character, the movies like this can sometimes feel preachy, or as if they're trying to, that the thematics are being forced through with the plot structure, and that character, Kathy, is sort of the worst offender in that regard. Now, with that being said, I think this film is at its best when it's dealing with Phil Green, dealing with his family, his mother, his son, and then there's friend Dave, who is actually Jewish. So this scene right here is Phil's going to struggle mightily to explain the concept of anti-Semitism to his kid. As a point of reference for Quantum Leap fans, that's Dean Stockwell, who apparently is still alive, which is kind of shocking. Anyway, this scene, I really like how this scene is written. I really like there's sort of an implicit criticism that anti-Semitism is very, very childish. That's so childish that even a child can't understand it. and at the same time, there's sort of a understanding that anti-Semitism is not just just one of the family of bigotries, because what really sort of trips up Phil here is his son asking if, well, who can hate us? We're just Americans then, because he doesn't quite understand the difference between like nationality and religious identity, and that's all sort of interesting. I gotta say this. The scene very much reminds me of a scene in Moonlight where the kid is having the word faggot explained to him. And I think there's interesting that there's this great continuity in the Best Picture winners. And that's what I meant a long time ago when I said there's a long line of social dramas that have won Best Picture. I was specifically thinking of this scene. In any case, there's that. The other sort of thing that... I guess say about this movie is it's actually very, very depressing in a lot of ways, because it feels, especially with like the implicit bias stuff, it feels very, very modern, and probably the probably the part that is the most obvious with that is this guy right here is going to because at this point he's pretending to be Jewish, and so he's going to have what we refer to as microaggressions today, but really just sort of a backhanded, oh, you're in public relations implying because you're a Jew, because he's Jewish, even though implying he couldn't fight, etc. And so he's going to say, hey, some of my best friends are Jewish. And I really like her retort, and some of your best friends are Methodists, but you never mention that. And that's like, it's a good retort, but at the same time, it's fucking depressing in that my best friends are blank as a defense of bigotry. It doesn't really work. Existed as far back as 1947 to the point where they were mocking it in a movie in 1947, and it feels like that's just never going to die. Made myself sad. Now, this scene right here is probably the most famous in the film. He's in... so Gentleman's Agreement, the title refers to how there were unwritten agreements of neighborhoods where Jewish people just wouldn't be allowed to be served, or public accommodations, etc., etc., etc. And so this scene is all about him being rejected from the hotel, because they think he's Jewish, and and it's sort of a public accommodation thing. This today is blatantly illegal because of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, which included religion. And the thing is about this scene is that I really like the writing's sharp and everything, it's to the point, but I really like Kazan's direction here. In that, if you look at not so much the manager and him, because they know what's going on, it's all the other people who aren't looking at him when he turns around, but we're looking at him, and you really feel his humiliation and everything like that, and how he's sort of marked as the other. Again, I feel like it would have been so much more powerful if the character was actually Jewish as opposed to pretending to be Jewish, and it feels kind of false because of that. God damn it. Anyway, so that's probably the most famous scene in the movie. That problem is not going away. Incidentally, even though like for Jewish people it's illegal, LGBT people still face that, etc. Okay, so this scene right here is the scene that somewhat justifies the whole I'm pretending to be Jewish thing. Is Kathy, they're in a relationship, fiance, and he had to extend it to his family to not blow his cover, basically. So his poor kid got called some anti-Semitic names, and she's going to comfort him, not by saying what she should have said, that those kids are assholes, but that, no, it's okay, you're not Jewish, as if it's implying that there's something wrong to be Jewish. And of course he gets offended by that. The scene is very much cut apart, and so here he is criticizing her for saying, by pointing out the privilege that she gave his kid. And here's the thing, I really like her response and like this back and forth, because she's like, you think I'm a horrible anti-Semite? And he's like, no, I don't. I think you're a decent person who's just willing to go along with anti-Semitism because it's easier. I mean, that's sort of the subtext of the scene. And in that way, I think the film is sort of refreshingly contemporary because Trumpism has made overt bigotry, especially around race and immigration status, unfortunately, and sex, much more common than it once was. I still think the great mass of people have this sort of covert, I'm going to go along to get along sort of, like, she's not really anti-Semitic. She doesn't really hate Jewish people. She just, as she says here, she recognizes her privilege, and she recognizes that it's just easier to accept it. And so she's not anti-Semitic to her core, and she doesn't hate Jewish peoples, but she is anti-Semitic in behavior. And which in some ways is worse because she senses like sort of the evil of it, but she's not willing to stand up. And her plot thread, Kathy plot thread, is her learning to stand up for her beliefs, which is fine. It still feels kind of forced and everything. But in any case, I really do like that a film from 1947 was smart enough or aware enough to include overt and covert, and the difference between being really proudly bigoted and sort of this much more go along to get along bigotry like she represents. In any case, that's going to be it for today. Gentleman's Agreement's a pretty good film. It has several structural problems, but it's well acted, sort of interesting, fucking depressing given its time period it was released. So anyway, see you guys tomorrow.